of a university, the inauguration of a lecture series. We're happy tonight to recognize the beneficence of one of our professors emeritus, Dr. and his wife, Dr. and Mrs. Charles Van Cleve. As a professor of English, one of his courses that he enjoyed teaching most here was a course that was called The Bible as Literature. And both of these interests are reflected in this lectureship, which is to alternate annually between the Office of Religious Programs and the Department of English. As a person to inaugurate this lecture series, we turn to a person whom we thought would be knowledgeable in a field of current interest in the area of religion. What's happening among youth and religion in the United States today. So we turn to Mr. Bob Richards. I think many of you know Bob as a very many talented individual. You recognize him for his athletic achievement and his contribution to American sports, but he's also had a background as a minister and a college professor. Our speaker was born and reared in Champaign, Illinois, where he started as a high school football and basketball player, as well as in track and field. But it was at the University of Illinois where he received his Bachelor and Master's of Arts degrees that his rise to athletic stardom began. He became one of the top pole vaulters in history when in competition he cleared the 15-foot mark more times than any other athlete. He competed in 3 Olympics, bringing home 2 gold medals and 1 bronze medal. At Helsinki in 1952, he set a new Olympic record and is the only pole vaulter in Olympic history to win the gold medal twice. As a result of this, he was voted by a tribunal of sports writers to the all-time Olympic team, and later was to cover the Olympic Games as a radio broadcaster. He informed us in a dinner meeting just before this time that he has worked in all of the Olympic Games except one since that time. He's looking forward to competing in what they call a Masters tournament following the Olympic, it's part of the Olympic Games, the coming Olympic Games. He also showed excellence in that grueling test of physical proficiency, the decathlon, by grabbing the American national title in 1951, 54, and 55. He made All-American in track and field for 11 years, 1948 through 1957. Some of the honors he received for his phenomenal athletic achievements include the Helms Foundation Trophy, the Sullivan Memorial, Helms Hall of Fame, and Madison Square Garden Hall of Fame awards. In 1954, he was named Goodwill Ambassador to Asia by the State Department, and in 1957 he received the Signal Honor not only for his athletic accomplishments, but for his contribution to the general welfare of people. The United States Junior Chamber of Commerce selected him as one of the 10 outstanding young men in America in that year, 1957. That same year, he retired from athletic competition and assumed the position of Executive Director of the Wheaties Sports Federation. He was appointed by President Eisenhower as a member of the President's Council on Youth Fitness and originated the basic ideas for Junior Champ, a program in cooperation with the USJCs and the U.S. Olympic Committee, from which many participating youngsters have gone on to star in national championships. In 1959, Bob was the only American to photograph the first Russian-United States track meet in Moscow, and a year later participated in the first U.S. television coverage of the Olympic Games from Rome. He has taught philosophy at Laverne College, a college of his particular church. He has produced 5 speech films and several sports films. He is author of a book, The Heart of a Champion, and at the present time is engaged primarily in full-time lecturing, primarily to business groups on motivation. He is an ordained minister of the Church of the Brethren. Very happy to present in this first of the Van Cleve Lecture Series, Mr. Bob Richards, to speak on the topic of youth and Christianity. Thank you.
Very, very much. Thank you immensely. I can't tell you how happy I am, literally, to be invited to give this first lecture in the Van Cleve lecture series, very few people recognize that my basic love is that of philosophy of religion. Mostly I go around the country telling sports stories and trying to motivate people along the idea of success, psychology, and that sort of thing. So when I got this invitation, I told my secretary, I said, do it. I don't care what it costs or whatever it is, do it. So this is one of these rare things that really excites me. I'm delighted to be here. Now, all of you are probably wondering, what's this old pole vaulting preacher going to say in regard to the Bible and literature? You're probably thinking a little bit like the coaches did. They were debating which one had the dumbest athlete, and the football coach said, man, I got the dumbest character in sports that ever lived, and the basketball coach said, I got a dumber one. So they made a bet, and the football coach said, watch this. He said, hey, Pete, and this great big 300-pound football player came running up, and bam, bam, he hit both sides of the door, and he said, yes, sir. He said, here's a quarter, go out and buy me a Cadillac. Yes, sir, and he grabbed the quarter, went out, bam, bam, hit both sides of the door, and kept going. Football coach said, can you believe that guy is that dumb that he would think he could buy a Cadillac with a quarter? Basketball coach said, man, that ain't nothing. Watch this. Hey, oh, ain't. I shouldn't use ain't at an English thing, should I? But anyway, watch this one. So he said, hey, Joe, and this great big tall basketball player came up, bam, hit his head on the door, and went straight up to the coach and said, yes, sir. He said, go down to my office and see if I'm there. Yes, sir. And out he goes, and bam, hits his head on the door again, and he keeps going. Basketball coach says, can you think of anything any dumber than that? So they were debating which one had won the bet, and the two athletes met out at the elevator, the big football player and the great big basketball player. And the football player said, you know, my coach has been hit too many times. He gave me the money to buy him a car, but he didn't tell me what color he wanted. The big, tall basketball player said, you think that's something? My coach just sent me down to his office to see if he was there. He had a telephone he could have called and found out for himself. Well, if there's one illusion that persists in America today, it's the illusion that all athletes are dumb. There's one rather nice thing about that. There's two things in the country you can tell jokes about: dumb athletes and preachers. And since I happen to be both, that makes it a very interesting thing. Tonight I'm not going to speak on sports per se, maybe an occasional reference, but I am going to try to uphold the basic orientation of this lecture series in terms of religion and literature. And I hope that in talking about today's youth and some of the problems they're facing, I can make some kind of sense. I hope I don't do what a preacher did who looked like Louis Armstrong. Everywhere he went in this particular new town, the people would take a look at him and they'd glance to one side and they'd say, it's him, it's Louis Armstrong. He kept saying, no, I'm Reverend Elijah Pitts. I'm the pastor of the new church. I'm just trying to get acquainted with people. I'm trying to help them with their problems. But everywhere he would go, people would take a double take and they'd say, it's Louis, it's Sashmo, it's Louis Armstrong. Well, he went up on this one porch, knocked on the door, and the lady of the house came out and she said, as I live and breathe, it's Louis Armstrong in our little town. He said, no, lady, I'm Reverend Elijah Pitts. I'm the pastor of the new church. I'm just trying to help people with their problems. She said, well, maybe you can help us because we've got a 21-year-old girl upstairs just crazy about men. He said, well, I'll do the best that I can. So he trudges up the stairs and knocks on the door, and out comes this gorgeous 21-year-old girl. She takes one look at him and cries out, Sashmo, Louis Armstrong. And she throws her arms around him, and he says, hello, Dolly. Well, I tell that old joke for a reason. Sashmo, I'm sure, has gone to his reward. He's probably up there with Gabriel blowing the horn right now, metaphorically speaking. But for an older preacher to come in and try to tell 21-year-old young people about the Jesus movement or about contemporary trends in religion, I suppose is innocuous. And I hope I make a little bit more sense than walking out of here crying out, hello, Dolly. There is no question but what we face many problems. I'd like to suggest this. I don't believe in a generation gap. Now, I've spoken to over 9 million high school students, college students, in my little life. I don't believe there is a single thought that young people hold today but what there is a counterpart in an older person. There is no escapist pattern that a young person will be embracing but what an older person has the same escapist pattern. There's no spoiled brat kid that doesn't have a spoiled brat mother and father. There's no dope among children but what can't be duplicated in alcoholic parents. I don't believe in a generation gap. I don't believe young people are bad. I don't believe they're all good. I don't believe older folks are all bad or all good. The truth of the matter is we're all people with problems. Many people in today's world are quite concerned about which way young people are going to go. In my time, if you had ever suggested that a man would become a bum or a dope addict or a communist, or if you would ever suggest that the psychology of the prostitute would be embraced wholeheartedly, I'm sure everyone in my town would have laughed at such a suggestion. It'll never happen. Or that the country itself would be condemned and censured, and people would want to tear down the establishment. I have no doubt that some people embrace these ideas, but I'm convinced that as many older people hold these ideas as young people. Now, the fact that we have a type of society where everyone can be free to do exactly what they want to do, where if a person wants to be a dope addict, he can be a dope addict. If he wants to try every conceivable kind of chemical drug that he wants to, he can do this. And so many people with askance are wondering what is taking place. And so when they see a thing called the Jesus movement hitting New York, where, ironically enough, a rather silly, mundane thing called Jesus Christ Superstar, they expect to make $20 million. Just the name Jesus will make $20 million when it's done in a psychedelic way or with a mod twist or whatever it might take. One of the things that impresses a person who has lived just a little bit through World War II, the development of certain scientific innovations, etc., one of the things that impresses you is that this person, Jesus, always seems to confront history. Think of him however you will. Whether you think of him as divine, as a great teacher, or as one Frenchman thought of him, a complete fool and idiot. Think of him however you will, it's amazing how that history recurrently confronts the figure and personality of Jesus. What can I say regarding Christianity and youth today? Now, the first thing I want to say in this lecture tonight is every person here is a skeptic, and every person here is a believer. Every person who is alive tonight is asserting his belief in life. And every person here, if you were to press them philosophically, would say, I believe in truth. You can't even doubt a statement that another person makes unless you imply the truth of your own doubt, or the truth of the term I doubt. Everyone believes in something. But I can also say this, there isn't a person here that isn't skeptical of something. The idea that one person is a believer and the other person is a skeptic is, in a sense, nonsense. All of us range from skepticism to belief in a wide variety of subject matter. But in today's world especially, I feel that young people are confronting psychologically something that goes beyond just the ordinary confrontation of, say, school and 3 hours or material existence. They're going through the struggle for meaning and purpose. They want to know what life is all about, who they are, but they want to know something even deeper than that, what life is all about. You look up into a vast cosmos, 55 billion universes like our own. Have any of you ever questioned what meaning, purpose your life has in a universe so vast that the nearest star is millions light years away? Is life what one great scholar put, snowflake on a river that melts and is gone? Or as perhaps Dr. Van Cleve would have put it in Shakespeare's language, what is life? The tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, the story of a poor player who struts and frets his brief hour upon the stage, and then he's heard of no more. This is the philosophy of the skeptic. We think it's very new. We think that the counterculture concept is very new. To be hep on drugs, or a new way of living, or to tear everything down and to go out and live life exactly the way you want to. But many, many years ago it was formulated in a philosophy, eat, drink, and be merry. But it had a very negative ending, for tomorrow you die. I don't think there's any one subject that has been impressed upon young people today more than the subject of death. We've been telling young people ever since the first grade that the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, the cobalt bomb, the doomsday bomb can wipe them out. Our youth have grown up in the atmosphere of the psychology of death. And if you believe Sigmund Freud when he says that everyone has within them a death urge anyway, you can imagine the enormous tendency of young people to concentrate on this subject matter called death. I want to refer to this later. But many of the psychological phenomena happening today among young people are related to the fact that we've impressed upon them from almost the first grade through college that death is the end result of the world, all man's aspirations, his ambitions, his dreams, and motives. You can't focus on death. You can't emphasize the death urge without evoking certain kinds of responses. Personally, I believe the fundamental motivation in taking dope is a death urge. One of my very good friends is Art Linkletter. And ever since his daughter jumped screaming out of a building in California, Art Linkletter has been changed. He can't talk about anything else but this dope problem. This man who was at one time gay and lighthearted, now this is all he can think about. And he wants to try to save other young people. But primarily, if you feed young people on the idea that their existence is so limited, they've only got a few short years to live and then some maniac's going to blow the whole thing to pieces, what do you expect to emerge out of their morals? Frankly, I think it's amazing what young people have done in the midst of so much negativism. A few years back, I saw on Life magazine a picture of a boy who had copped out. He'd been broken for marijuana usage, while about 2 million college students were graduating from college, ready to assume responsibility in this great country. Not one single word was mentioned of these college graduating students, and a whole magazine with something like 6 million circulation was dedicated to a cop-out who had gone to Greece and his problems. It's amazing how we focused on the negative. We have eulogized the people who are negatively oriented. The Rap Browns, the Eldridge Cleavers, the Jerry Rubins, the Kunzlers, the A.B. Hoffmans. We have glorified them And then we wonder why they appear to have such a following. The truth of the matter is that down in the middle of the soul of every young people or person that I've met today, there's a tremendous struggle going on. It's the struggle for meaning, purpose, in a world of death, in a world of negativism. To try to discover it, to try to find it. Many years ago, Albert Einstein made this statement. He's perhaps the greatest scientist the world has ever known. He said, science cannot solve our moral problems. He said, only a great creative religion can solve the moral problems of man. Now, this is the guy who gave the world atomic energy and the theory of the atom and just about everything else you can think of in modern science. His contribution defies imagination. Without getting into that, a subject that I know very little bit about, Einstein so succinctly saw that if you're going to solve the psychological problems of people, you need a great creative religious point of view, a Weltanschauung, if you will, a world philosophy. Man cannot live by bread alone, said one infinitely greater. He's right. The soul must have meaning and purpose. Augustine, many years ago, put it this way: Thou, O God, hast made us for thyself. Our souls are restless, till they find their rest in thee. Georgia Harkness calls it the dark night of the soul, when a man battles to find purpose, meaning, significance, worth in a world collapsing all around him. The greatest man I've read the past year is the great psychologist Jung. Jung, in his book just before he died, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, says this, that if ever there was a time when people were searching for ultimate values and ultimate concern, it is now. In his Gifford lectures, and by the way, I was hoping the Van Cleve lectures would be something similar to the Gifford lectures, Dr. Van Cleve. I'd wanted to do a doctor's thesis on the Gifford lectures. But in his great book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung says this, that he's never known of a religious, or rather a cure of a person with a psychological problem, but what that person had some religious inclinations. Let me repeat that. He has never known of a person who was psychologically cured, who had an emotional problem, but what that person had some religious feelings or inclinations. Then he goes on to say in this latest book that I referred to, I have never doubted the reality of God. A transcendental subconscious force that can come into human life and give it meaning and purpose and significance. This is where I think the crux of the battle within the soul is today. Read Jung's book and you will fathom far greater the kind of thing I am trying to indicate with language. The struggle within the person to find something of worth to give life to. Peter Marshall said it in a prayer in the Senate once when he said, "Oh God, help us to believe in something so we just won't give our lives to anything." When life is not committed, when it does not have meaning and purpose, it tends to be given to almost anything, whatever cause it might be. Communism, dope, whatever it might be. What I'm trying to say is life must have an orientation. Now, in the nihilism of our time, recently I read a philosopher who said, let's face it, we don't have anything to say. Nihilism is all we can give, or relativism. All we can say to people is everything is relative. Your opinion's as good as any other opinion. A pig's grunt is as good as a statement of value. This is the kind of struggle, the dark night of the soul, that many young people are going through. They are struggling to find meaning and purpose. I submit to you that this meaning and purpose will never be found without a belief in some kind of God. William James, who is the greatest psychologist that America has ever produced, he also gave the Gifford Lectures, Varieties of Religious Experience. But William James was about to commit suicide. He'd analyzed the whole structure of life. He was brilliant, but he couldn't seem to find much meaning in just the accumulation of knowledge. And he was about to hurl himself off into a river in New York off a huge bridge when all of a sudden he stopped himself and he said, "Now why am I doing this? Life surely must mean more than hurling yourself off into the abyss, into nothingness." Out of that experience came the great essay called The Will to Believe, in which William James asserts this: you must will to believe that there is some meaning and purpose in the world. You must will to believe there is a God. You must will to believe that the universe has ultimate ends and purposes, and that this whole thing is going to one great finality. Now, of course, Bertrand Russell has written a counteracting point of view called The Will to Disbelieve, where he refuses to accept this. But James, who was a pragmatist, says that you measure religion more by its practical results than you do by its theoretical orientation. I have always been a pragmatist in religion. As Schopenhauer and Elisha Jordan of Butler University expressed it, it is a thing that you feel its truth more than you can prove cognitively its validity. It's something you feel, but it works in life. It makes you happier. Life must have meaning and purpose. It must have an end, because if it didn't, all of us would commit suicide. Life must have a God. Whitehead, the great philosopher, said this: no man could think unless he believed that the universe was intelligible, that out there somewhere there was truth, there was fact. I submit that this is part of the thing that young people are going through today. We call it the Jesus movement, and it might be adorned in the beads and so forth of hippies or overalls or whatever it might be, but that isn't the significant thing. I don't think religion has much to do with clothes or much of the moral paraphernalia we have associated with religion. By the way, may I say this? Religion has done as much harm as it has good for people. Recently I talked to a psychologist in a mental institution. He said, I wish you preachers would quit putting guilt feelings in these people, because we have to try to cope with these guilt feelings. It's unbelievable how many persons have been frustrated in life by the one thing that should give them the greatest happiness and meaning in life: religion. I made a study once. It happens to pertain to my own church, so I can be critical of it. Back in the 1880s, they were concerned about the clothes you wore and gilt-edged hymn books, and I forget what other kind of silly thing it was. How you would part your hair, whether you'd part it on this side or in the middle or on this side. So a group of men got together and they decided that you could part it on the right, on the left, and down the middle, because one of them parted his head on this side, one on this side, and one down the middle. But what makes this so significant is, while they were debating such picayune, unimportant matters, in that year the theory of evolution in Darwin and Wallace came into the world. Freud's psychoanalysis came into the world. Karl Marx's Das Kapital just emerged in the world. Harvey's theory of circulation and a whole host of medical discoveries had just been made, while religion was discussing the most inane subjects, the world was being filled with world-shaking ideas. I've often said this: religionists drive me from religion, atheists drive me back to it. Religionists drive me from it, atheists drive me back to it. I don't know how many of you have been honest with your own soul in regard to religion. I remember once, after a terrific religious conversion, that I had come to the conclusion that there was no God. And I remember walking out on the front porch, my home in Champaign, Illinois, and I looked up and I said, all there is out there is electrons and protons, and there's nothing else. Just a vast void of emptiness. That's all there is. Have you ever, honest to God, or I guess you can't put it that way, but have you ever, honest to skepticism or whatever it is, come to grips with that kind of feeling? Where you really don't believe there is something out there? That everything is just chance? You talk about the despair of the soul. This is the despair of the soul. Well, I went through this. And I think I've come out more strongly convinced than ever before that there is a God. Like Jung, like James, like many other great scholars. When a man like Einstein, who studies this thing of 55 billion universes, can come out and say, why I believe in God. God is for me. That superior, illimitable reason who reveals himself in the slight details we are able to perceive with our finite minds. To know what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting himself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, is to me the essence of all religion. Now, when a great scholar like that, the greatest scientist of all history, can make a statement like that, there must be some substance to this belief in a superior being who cares and loves you. Lecomte de Noy's book, Human Destiny, has a line in it that I think is so terrific. The people who argue that this whole thing is simply the product of chance, billions of years of formulations and just rolling this direction and that direction until order comes in one spot and order comes in another, and a human being emerges and mind and intelligence just happens, and there's oxygen and vitamins and all this stuff just happens to be. This great expert in probability and chance says it would take 1 million monkeys, 1 million years, typing on 1 million typewriters to create one line accidentally of Shakespeare. And Lecomte de Noy goes on to say that on the basis of the theory of probability, it is inconceivable that this gigantic thing we call the universe just happened to be by chance and accident. And he says of Laplace's contention, Laplace said, God, I have no need of that hypothesis. He says, I have need of that hypothesis because I can't explain it any other way. Now, of course, the big step is to go from a God that creates a vast universe where they don't even know whether it's expanding or contracting. But anyway, the God of this universe, is that God concerned about this little fly speck down here called me? That's where the whole thing finds its crux. And by the way, Hegel, the great German philosopher, said this: the greatest idea that has ever penetrated the mind of man. If you analyze all of poetry, all of literature, all of philosophy, read all the books, he says, the one great idea that dwarfs all the others is this one, that God loves man so much he became part of man's struggle. Now that's the leap of faith of the soul. This is what Socrates talks about when he says you come up to a corner and you can't see around it. That's where the leap of the soul is, the leap of faith. This is personalism. The idea that there is in me that which is out there. The old Stoics said it many years ago, I'm a microcosm of the macrocosm. Whatever is in me must be in this big universe. I have a mind. I have a will. I have a heart. There must be something corresponding to me out there, else where did I come from? I have always thought this to be the greatest argument for the existence of God there is. Descartes, the great French philosopher, said, where do I get this idea of an infinite being? I'm not infinite. Where do I get the idea of an infinite being? Unless he put it in my mind. Kick it around all you want. As I mentioned to a group of students this afternoon at a press conference, man cannot get rid of the idea of God. For 40 years in communist Russia, they have tried to get rid of the concept of God. And in a recent survey, it was revealed 98% of the people of Russia still believe in God. Where do you get such ideas? Descartes said he must have put it there. I look at myself and I say, you say I came from an amoeba? You say I came from all kinds of forces working together in biological mutations and adaptations to this environment and that environment, and through the process of billions of years I have thought and will and purpose. And here's where I go to Bergson, the great French philosopher, who says in his book on evolution, creative evolution, he says, why didn't it devolve the other way? Why is it all upwards to man? Why didn't it go the other way, down to nothingness? He says there is nothing that gives one a belief in God any more than this one, that the whole evolutionary process has culminated in a being that is like God. Now the Bible puts it, we are made in His image. And however weak we might be, and however limited our knowledge might be, and however frail we might be as people, we are still like Him. What I'm trying to say is, there is as much proof for the reality of God, even theoretically, as there is in this emotional want. Now, Immanuel Kant, perhaps the greatest philosopher of all time, put all the arguments for the existence of God on one side and all the arguments against the existence of God on the other. And he said, the proofs are equal. The critique of pure reason can't solve the problem. But then he goes right down at the bottom and says, but my soul asserts there is a God. And he goes on to say, I refuse to believe that this whole thing we call man just goes to nothing. That this whole evolutionary process goes up in a fizzle of smoke, and that's the end. And Immanuel Kant, perhaps the world's greatest philosopher of all time, says, I believe in God and I believe in immortality. In many schools today, they're studying death. I don't know where religion draws any more relevance than when it comes to the subject matter of death. You can study poetry. You can study a lot of comments on death. But when you get to dealing with this thing called death, it's where the soul really comes to grips with its ultimate reality. Socrates, Plato, in writing The Republic, tells about Socrates going to see his old friend Thrasymachus. And he's getting old and he's approaching death. And Socrates says, "What do you think about when you get old and you're approaching death?" And Thrasymachus looked at him and said, "Well, you think about religion and God." It's what they call foxhole religion in war. Men go out, the darkness of the night, the bombs exploding, the tracer bullets going all over the place. And all of a sudden, a man is thinking about something he never thought of before. I wonder if it isn't the sort of a phenomena that kids on dope experience. They realize that they're dead if they continue. They're hooked. I worked with Teen Challenge and some of these other groups that get to these kids. And they realize that they are dead. They are actually dead if they continue. And they breathe somewhat the same prayer as the alcoholic in Alcoholics Anonymous. The alcoholic, knowing that he's going to go to death, cried out, "Oh God, if there be such a God, help me. Help me." One day at a time. Well, they're finding the same phenomena with dope. That these kids cry out to a being. They don't even know if he exists or not, but they cry out, "Help me." I remember reading Henry C. Link's books, The Return to Religion, in which this atheistic psychiatrist was practicing for years, and he couldn't help people. He could analyze them, he could tell them all their problems, he could break them down in little pieces, but he couldn't put them back together again. So, after working with patient after patient after patient, finally in desperation he said to one depressed lady, Go pray to God. Ask God to help you." And he found a remarkable improvement in the lady. Was kind of stunned. So he started recommending it to others. Ask God to help you. Ask God to help you. And amazingly discovered that the therapy worked when people started praying to a divine being. I had a friend once, Long Beach, California, who had his master's, rather doctor's degree in psychology, and his wife was a practicing psychologist. Told about their son, went through acute depression, etc., tried to commit suicide several times, and this great scholar, trained at Yale, knew practically every psychoanalytical thought that had ever been given. One day went to his son and said, "Son, here's the Bible, the New Testament. Read it. God loves you. See if it will work." And this boy, who had tried to commit suicide 4 times, started reading the New Testament. Now, I'm sure most people here have read at least parts of the New Testament. Leafing through the pages, incomprehensible in spots, this guy started getting a new meaning and significance into his life. And this great PhD in psychology, tears running down his face, said to me, "Bob, my boy is well today because he gave his life to God and started believing the great truths of the Bible." What do you do with stories like this? What do you do with a Henry C. Link, who writes another book called The Rediscovery of the Soul? I found out that a man must have some kind of spiritual orientation. William Sadler, the great psychiatrist, says the same thing. There are 6 levels to human life: the physical, the mental, the emotional, the volitional, the aesthetic, and the spiritual. He says you don't deal with any person's problem until you recognize all levels. And the spiritual is the most important. This is what I say is what is behind the Jesus movement, or any movement in history where youth in confusion trying to answer some of the basic questions of life. This is where they must come. Now, you can go either direction. But like William James, I believe you've got to come out on the side of God and purpose and meaning and value and worth. This is where I get the immortality. I know what the skeptics must be thinking in this vast auditorium tonight. But I draw one with Kant and Plato and others who said there must be something beyond this life. Laugh, if you will, when Socrates in his metaphor calls it getting in a boat and going on the other side. Kant says, I refuse to believe that I die. I must go on. There is perhaps no greater poem in English literature than the one Tennyson wrote. And I know you know this one, Dr. Van Cleve, better than most. He went to the funeral of his friend Hallam. Here was one of the strongest, healthiest, most vital men he'd ever met, and all of a sudden there he is dead. The ghostly pallor over his face, the grayness. And he looks at that man and says, is that the end? Is this what life is all about? And so he dedicates a poem to Hallam. And in the middle of that poem are the most priceless theological statements that have ever been written as far as I'm concerned. Listen to what he says. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thou madest man, he knows not why, he thinks he was not made to die. Thou hast made him. Thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood thou. Our wills are ours, we know not why. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Our little systems have their day, and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, for thou, O Lord, art more than they. When a great scholar, a great mind, comes to the end of life and sees that kind of an answer, he's simply fulfilling an inclination, an instinct, a propensity, if you will, of the soul to assert life and its value and its meaning. George Santayana said something similar, the great philosopher of Spain. I don't suppose many of his works will be remembered, but one little poem that he wrote will live on in the minds of people forever and ever and ever. This is what he said. O world, thou choosest not the better part. 'Tis not wisdom to be only wise, and on the inward vision close the eyes. 'Tis wisdom to believe the heart. Columbus found a world without a chart, save the one that faith deciphered in the skies. To trust the soul's invincible surmise was his only compass and his only art. Our knowledge is but a lighted, smoky pine that lights the way one step ahead. Across the vast mystery of void and dread, bid then the tender light of faith to shine, by which the mind of man is led into the thinking of the thought divine. Death, meaning, purpose. This is the age. This is what we're confronting. Who am I? What is life? What is the purpose of it all? To many, they are asserting the soul's surmise that life does go on. I've had this experience in my own life. I suppose ultimately religion is a subjective matter. Each and every person has to work out their own salvation, I suppose, in terms of what is meaningful, significant for them. I can only say this to you, that the most important thing that ever happened to me in my life was when I believed that out there, beyond those clouds and the blue sky, there was somebody who cared for me, who watches over me, who is concerned about what I do. I don't know of any better way to put it than a story I used to tell in sports, and I'm closing with this one little story. A football player who had played at Columbia University was on the fourth team. For 4 years he'd been there. He didn't care much about football. He was just banging around, having a ball. They were playing for the conference championship, and 3 days before the final game, Lou Little was given a telegram to tell this boy that his father was dead. So Coach Lou Little of Columbia took the telegram to him and said, I understand you'll have to be gone for the funeral. The boy said, I'm going to the funeral Saturday morning, Coach, but I'll be back for the game. Well, Lou Little didn't think too much about it. The boy went to the funeral, came back and said, Coach, I want you to start me in this football game. And Lou said, I can't do it. It's too important. It's the closing game. We've just got to win this championship. He said, Coach, I've been with you 4 years. Give me a chance. Just start me on the kickoff and let me prove to you what I can do. To make the story short, he went in on the kickoff and made the opening tackle. He made practically every other tackle that day. He was absolutely a giant on defense. In on every tackle, in the middle of every pileup, he was there. Coach Little couldn't understand it. They won the game. Afterwards, he personally congratulated this fellow. Said, today you are an All-American. I have never seen anything like it. For 4 years you've been nothing. He said, I can't understand the difference. What happened to you? And the boy turned to Coach Lou Little and said, well, Coach, you knew my dad had died. He said, yes. I gave you the telegram. He said, you knew my dad was blind, didn't you? He said, yes. I've seen you lead him across the campus many times. With tears in his eyes, the boy said, today is the first football game my dad ever saw me play. It makes a difference when those unseen eyes are watching. It makes a difference when you realize that that's somebody out there who made you, loves you, and gives himself for you. This is what I think young people need today.
You might also want to greet Dr. and Ms. Van Cleve, who made possible this lectureship. Dr. and Ms. Van Cleve, will you please stand? Back here. Thank you, Bob, for sharing with us so personally and intelligently and movingly of the alternatives you see facing today's youth and the youth of every age. Mr. Richards has agreed to answer any questions you might wish to direct in this way. Is there someone who'd like to ask a question of Mr. Richards?
I would hope that I've stimulated somebody.
Not philosophy, maybe about sports.
Let's scare them away with not sports.
question is, what do you mean by the leap of faith, the term that he used?
Well, first let me give you a couple of other terms that may be as meaningful as that one. Socrates was the one who coined the original concept, the leap of faith. And in Socrates, and by the way, he was a very intellectual man. After Socrates came Aristotle, and he had a profound influence on Greek thought. But when you come to, this is cognitively, when you come to a place where you can't draw a normal syllogism or a normal deduction, you take a leap of faith. Now, philosophers are not the only ones that do this. Scientists do it. For example, the theory of evolution is a leap of faith. They span many, many, many years with a theory that says man evolved from lower forms of animals. And by the way, there's 365 different theories of evolution, or more than that, by the way. But it's a leap of faith. Einstein did it. When Einstein was trying to prove curved space, and when he was trying to say that Euclidean geometry did not work, that is, straight line space, he had to make certain predictions, and the eclipse of the moon, as I understand it, was a very small proof. But he was able to predict the time so accurately as over against others that the whole Einsteinian theory, so to speak, came out of this. Well, no, it didn't come out of it, but was based upon this. But at one time, this was a leap of faith. Practically every great scholar, in order to formulate a structure, has a moment when there's a leap of faith where he postulates something, he can't prove it, and then he starts to work around it. All of thought is based upon this thing we call the leap of faith. The musician has the same thing. He'll throw a note out here or some notes out there, and he starts putting them together. There's a moment where it's almost pure faith. It creates the music. Athletes do it. I know athletes growing up, skinny, fat kids who say, I'm going to break the world's record. Well, you look at them and you say, they can't break the world's record. But it's an idea in their brain, and they work, and their bodies expand, and pretty soon they're breaking the world's record. There's a moment when the thing is in the beginning pure faith. I'm down at Cape Kennedy, and I'm reading some of Werner von Braun's things that he wrote in 1947 about what it would take to go to the moon. Now, a simple little thing like that. That it would take a rocket with 7.5 million pounds of thrust to lift, all these various stages. Well, anyway, imagine my surprise. I'm reading this thing that Werner von Braun wrote in 47. There were no rockets like this. No lunar modules, etc. It was a leap of faith. They knew they were going to go to the moon. He knew it. But there was no way in the world he could possibly demonstrate it until the computers, the rockets, etc., came. Then he could put the whole thing together, and his faith became real. Now, what I'm trying to suggest with just these few illustrations is that there is a time in all thought, all science, all achievement, there is a moment where it's all faith. Then you start putting structure underneath your faith, so to speak. In this sense, scientific thought, now Aquinas saw this very clearly, scientific thought is no different from religious thought. When I postulate there's a God out there, and when I postulate that He created me, and that God loves me, now that's a huge jump there. That's a huge leap of faith. Aristotle had a God. He said he started the whole toboggan and he gave the thing a shove and just let it go. But he isn't concerned about it. He doesn't care where it goes. He just shoved it and let it go. Well, it's an enormous leap of faith when you say that that God is concerned about me. Now, on the other hand, I submit to you that I'm the greatest thing in this whole universe. You are the greatest thing in this whole universe. You. That computers and moons and stars don't compare to you. Now, I know it's an act of faith, and I'm metaphorizing here. But this is where religion claims its most important function. Now, the only way I can give structure to this, the only way I can prove it ultimately, is when I die. And that's a horrible way to prove it, but that's the way it has to be proved. And when you die, James says it makes a person much happier when they believe this. So on the basis of just being happier, you go ahead and subscribe to it. But what I'm trying to say is, all of thought requires a leap of faith. Whitehead, the world's intelligible. He says, now I realize that when I postulate that concept, that's a leap of faith. All of thought demands it. Take a thing. I don't know if you've read David Hume, the great skeptic. I took a whole course once in inductive skepticism, where we tried to analyze the presuppositions of inductive skepticism. In other words, here's a skeptic that says, well, you can't prove anything. You can't trust your eyes. You can't trust your senses. How can you believe anything? Well, you come back and say to them, well, how can you say, I doubt you? You have to imply the existence of I. You have to imply the validity of doubt. Now, all these are leaps of faith. You follow me? They are based upon, I can't prove it, but intellectually they are faith-oriented. I assume that I exist. I assume that I doubt. I assume that I think. Like Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Well, I assume I think, I assume I am. Now, you're laughing at me. Go ahead. But these are intellectual problems, but they have as their fundamental beginnings the step of intellectual faith. And I think you follow me. I can tell by the look in your eye. Now, all of life demands this. You believe in truth. You believe in life. You believe in happiness. These are acts of faith. In fact, I'll tell you something that will amaze you. The most faith I have seen has been in people who purportedly reject faith. Scientists and people of that caliber. Communists, for example, believe in their religion, and I believe communism is more of a religion than it is anything else, more than most Christians whom I have known. Communists believe their faith more than most Christians I've known. Talk about it more, believe in it more, will give more to it, etc., etc. But it's primarily an act of faith. If you had to try to prove Karl Marx's Das Kapital and the dialectic of history, the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and economic determinism, if you had to try to prove that, you'd have one heck of a time proving it. I recommend you a book. It's out of the Gifford Lectures. It's called The Nature and Destiny of Man by one of the great scholars in America. And in this book, he deals with these things. He says psychoanalysis, for example. Freud assumed the reality of the subconscious. Do you know it takes as much faith to believe in the subconscious as it does to believe in God? Now, Freud didn't believe in God. He called it an illusion. But it took as much faith for Freud to say there is a subconscious. There is an id. There is a libido. There's this whole thing inside. You say, where is it? Show me the id. Show me the libido. You can't see it. In this respect, one of the greatest acts of faith was when the atomic scientists tried to tell people there were atoms out there. Show me an atom. Show me an electron. You can't see them. In fact, have they ever been able to get hold of an electron yet? They never have they? It's going 186,000 miles a second. Kind of hard to get a hold of that thing. I've made my point. Much of what we call science today is faith. Now you answer me back. What do you think? That's the wildest one of all, I think. Yeah, sure. Any person you have a relationship with has a leap of faith. No friendship exists without faith. You gotta have faith in people. I'll tell you something else that'll come. You know life can exist unless a mother loves her child and has faith that she's learned something with what? She'd destroy life if she didn't. Certain things in life are absolute. A mother must take care of her child. None of us would be alive unless somebody took care of us. Because we don't say what we just got pregnant. But, you know, if civilization didn't have faith built in, well, you know, no family, no nothing. Let's not get into it. No, nothing. Maybe I better get back here. You might. Go ahead. What is what? A real Christian. Well, I think a Christian would be a believer in Christ. That's about as far as I can say. What do you think of a Christian? No. In fact, sometimes Christians ruin your religion. Just like you get educated without going to school, too. It helps to go to school. If you're in the right church, it'll help you very good. I know a lot of people that have been turned away from Christianity by going to church. You can believe that, but that's not too uncommon. Don't misconstrue my meaning. Well, I think you have implied in your question the answer. Yes, it is subjective. And I must say that I don't believe there is any such thing as the right church. Everywhere I go in America and the world, someone is trying to convert me to their point of view. And I could spell out the group. And I must admit I feel very sorry for these people. And I know young men and women who have given their lives trying to convert people to a sectarian point of view. And I think it's a very tragic phenomenon. They would do better sometimes to get people just to accept the faith in their own heart rather than subscribe to their point of view. Let me say this. I'm an aggressor. I believe in taking all the good out of every group that I'm in contact with. I've never met a group of people who didn't have something good. I mean, religious people. But I also reserve the right to reject what I don't like in their point of view. It ultimately is subjective. If you press me far enough, I'm sure you disagree with something that I believe. And if I press you far enough, I'm sure I disagree with you. That isn't what's important. The important thing is the general thing. particularize themselves. They almost always wanting to pretty people rather than help. And I really mean this when I say religion can hurt people. Actually hurt them. There's one little thing I know of homes that have been wrecked because of the puritanical concept of religion. I mean, the homes have been wrecked. That's not what religion wants. Religion wants happy homes, happy people, and fulfilled people. Not narrow, depressed, negative people. So it is subjective. Paul said, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Ultimately, you have no recourse in religion but your own thought, your own heart, your own will, your own relationship with God and Christ. That's the way it's right. That's for me. Now, what do you think? I put you on the spot. You probably said different. No. And I know I'm going against Scripture, but I don't believe in unpardonable sin. God forgives everything. There is no unpardonable sin. That's my belief. Now, you don't have to agree with me. Where sin does abound, grace does more abound. You know, I talked to a psychiatrist once who said that he believed over 50% of the people he had talked to thought they committed the unpardonable sin. And just imagine how many people are in mental institutions thinking they committed an unpardonable sin. Nothing we can do that God wants to do. Yes. Yes, I do. You want me to amplify or what? Go to the mic. You can't hear me? The question was, do I believe in life after death for those who have never been exposed to Christianity? I don't think there's a single entity ever brought into existence but what has life after death. That is, personal entity. Now, I must confess to you that I'm a universalist. I believe that in Christ, God reconciled the world unto himself, so that every man, woman, and child will be with God. I start off with a perfect universe, and I wind up with a perfect one. I'm a little bit like Leibniz, the great philosopher. They asked him if he thought the world was perfect. And he said, it's the best of all possible worlds. Meaning that God couldn't make it any differently. In order to develop you and me, in order to create another soul, and Tennyson wrestles with this problem, Dr. Van Cleve. He wrestles with this thing of how God could create something other than himself. But to do that, he had to make an imperfect world. But it's the best of all possible worlds, and ultimately it will be a perfect universe. Do I answer you? You may disagree with me, but like I said to you, see, this is where it's got to be subjective. Now, I can give you a lot of scriptures from my point of view, but that's where I am. I'm a skeptic, but I have an open mind. I'm not willing to say yes or no. If you ask me of a certain form, like in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about a type of reincarnation, a new body, etc., etc. When you get into this thing of what life is going to be after death, the forms, I can only say this. As I have studied it, the Bible is very general and not specific. In fact, the Bible suggests and hints broad, sweeping concepts. But every time you try to particularize it, You can't get the answer. You've got to work it out with the Holy Spirit and with God. That's my opinion. What do you think? Oh, I believe in ESP very strongly. It's proven fact. Duke University has been doing experiments for 20 years in parapsychology. Extrasensory perception is a reality. There are people who have it. No question. And it's a spiritual phenomenon as much as it is a mental phenomenon. I also think that there's so little known about the human being. Hypnosis is a thing that just staggers me when I think of what people do under hypnosis. Operations that are performed under hypnosis. The amazing powers within people that we know so little of. And I think some of these suggest important contributions to theology. It's been great to be with you.